So there is nothing like a new beginning. Who would not appreciate a new lease on life, or on anything for that matter? And I know I felt like a new person after I had the cardioversion and my heart returned to normal rhythm. There was nothing like that. So anyway, many of us might have been taught back in the day that Judaism was old and decrepit and needed to be replaced by something new and different. So Jesus founded a new and improved religion to replace it on Holy Thursday. But as the old song goes, it ain't necessarily true. The 12 apostles did not rise from their seats at the Last Supper with mitres and ecclesiastical power, ordained by Jesus to holy orders and consecrated as bishops. Instead, as I've mentioned before, Christianity did not really become a separate religion from Judaism until the 2nd century. An important factor in all this was the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, which destroyed Temple Judaism. So all Jews in Palestine had to find a new and different way to practice their faith, since the rites of the temple were ended forever. Rabbinical Judaism and Christianity were two strands that emerged from Temple Judaism, variations on a common theme. So we need to remember always, especially in light of what is the anti-Semitism that we see staring at us on the news every day, we need to remember always that in the beginning, those Jews who followed the Christian strand were not intent on reforming or rejecting their parent religion, because they regarded themselves as faithful Jews. And because of the proximity and the affiliation of the two religions, the Jesus strand incorporated aspects of Judaism right into their developing faith, to the point that our Catholic Mass follows the Jewish Sabbath service. The Jewish prayers over the bread and the wine are the prayers that we say at the Offertory. And of course, what became Christianity claimed the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, as their holy book. As the new faith branched into something different from the catastrophe called the abomination of desolation by faithful Jews, there was an opportunity for the followers of Jesus to use the gifts that they had been given to create something, I don't want to say new and different, but something that built on the traditions of the past. And you can see hints of this new attitude in Paul's deep esteem for women apostles like Junia and deacons like Phoebe, and in his recognition of their ministry. You can read about Mary Magdalene's grace-filled encounter with the risen Christ. And while we really literally know nothing about Peter, or we know a little bit about Peter and literally nothing about the rest of the apostles, Prisca and her husband Aquila, on the other hand, are mentioned approvingly in Scripture, or in the New Testament, 6 times. And we know that that couple was in Rome in the 40s and again in the late 50s when Paul wrote his letter to the Romans. And it was they, and not Peter and Paul, who founded the church in Rome. So I have become completely enamored of Prisca and Aquila as time has gone on. And so I began to wonder about them. And I wonder, were they part of the original disciples? Did they know Jesus? Were they his earliest disciples? Perhaps they had heard the words that came down to us in Matthew's gospel. You know that the rules of the Gentiles the rulers of the Gentiles lorded over, and their high officials exercise authority over them. But it shall not be that way with you. Because unlike Constantinople, Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria, and contrary to what Jesus said, there was no lording it over anybody in Rome for a couple of 100 years. Instead of having a pope, Rome was governed by a council of elders, perhaps in a tradition established by Prisca and Aquila. Like many charismatic movements that lose their creative edge as they become institutionalized, powerful, and rich, Christianity fell back on political and religious tropes of the past to justify new practices that were rapidly devolving into something very different from the teachings of Jesus. Increasingly powerful churchmen incorporated Roman law and Greek philosophy into the Judaism of Jesus, which intended to repair the world. They adopted the senatorial dress worn by the man who sentenced their founder to death. The early Christian liturgy was celebrated originally in either the vernacular or in Greek. As Rome grew in power, the language of empire was foisted upon the faithful, rendering the words of the liturgy meaningless and sending people into private devotionals. The new faith would fall quickly to the lowest common denominator and silence the voices of the women that Jesus and Paul admired and loved, crushing the spirit of hope. From experience, we all know that the past can be both a blessing and a curse. We were talking about that before Mass today. Karl Marx, who has been undeservedly maligned through the last century and a half, wrote that the tradition of dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the living. And while the skeletons who regularly rattle around the closet remind us that Marx is correct, it is also true that the past is a tapestry reflecting the circle of life that regularly transforms the face of the earth. And so it behooves us to pay attention to the difference between the two. The good news, because there's always good news, is that the Spirit is the variable that can change the equation. She is not constrained by anyone's past or present. She blows where she will, even as the powers try to bottle her up like a genie. The Spirit will always be who she will be, and she will untangle truth from the myths spun by the powerful. That truth includes the many women who carry on the tradition of Prisca, Junia, Phoebe, and Lydia, and the others that are recorded in the Gospels and epistles. In Rome, Grapte, mentioned in the first reading, was the equal of Clement, who was incorrectly named as the second pope. Perhaps she was on that council of elders I mentioned earlier. Half of Rome's churches were founded and hosted by women. Communities of widows became centers of evangelization and grew women leaders. The followers of Nympha, who is mentioned in Colossians, established a tradition of women leadership that still existed 400 years later. And while the churchmen offered brutalized and largely fictional virgin martyrs like Agnes, Cecilia, Dorothy, and Catherine as role models for Christian women, the real women of the church, women like Crispina, Olympias, Kale, Lita, Flavia, and Bishop Theodora, those women built catacombs and churches, celebrated the Eucharist, and baptized. The church's selective history buried the women's identities and deeds under cultural and religious prejudice that the institution to this day fails to recognize and address. And so the past, with its many myths, is a dangerous place to live. As modern folks struggle with the current problems that try the patience of a saint, it does no good to rely upon an idealized and largely mythological past that had its own share of problems to solve our problems in the 21st century. The puzzles of the present cannot be properly completed with pieces cut from the past. As our second reading says so beautifully, next year's words await another voice. But there is, of course, one voice that remains rock solid and steady and has repeated one continuous message throughout the centuries. The voice and the message hark back to the foundation of Judaism and embedded itself in Christianity. It was the message of Judaism that Jesus bequeathed to Christianity. And that voice says, you shall love the Lord, we'll leave the Lord out. You shall love God with your whole mind, your whole heart, and your whole soul. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Upon this, the entire law and the practice of all religious faith rest. This message rejects discrimination and oppression everywhere and at all times. And if followed as Jesus commanded, it will indeed repair the world. Paul, Prisca and Aquila, Junia, Crispina, Grapte, Olympias, and Theodora, they etched this command of Jesus to love one another upon their hearts. And so, my friends, should we.